I couldn't control it anymore. I had been pushed to the very end. Nick said it in a low, slow voice. The sentence carried no blame, nor did it contain any trace of anger. It came after a long silence, as if he were trying to put a name to something that had collapsed deep inside him a very long time ago. Inside the cold, sterile visitation room, Rob Reiner's son for the first time agreed to answer the question that the entire United States had avoided for days. Why did everything go so far beyond all limits? From that moment on, this story was no longer just a criminal case. It opened the door to far more difficult questions about childhood, about addiction, about mental health, and about the quiet spaces within families where people remain physically close to one another, yet no longer truly listen. Nick paused for a long time before speaking about what hurt the most. While his father stood behind films that made the whole country laugh and believe in happiness, there were nights when Nick wandered the streets, sleeping on park benches and apartment stairwells, living like a homeless person in the shadow of the fame carried by the Reiner name. And before this story goes any further, if Rob Reiner was ever a part of your memories, if he ever gave you laughter or a moment worth holding on to, leave a heart as a small tribute to him recently, as the investigation into the deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife remained shrouded in unresolved darkness. A rare meeting took place not in front of cameras and not for the public. It was a closed-door interview with Nick Reiner, Rob's son, who is currently considered the central suspect in the tragedy that has shaken all of Hollywood. The meeting took place in the visitation room of the detention facility, a place no one enters believing they will speak their final truth. There were no cameras, no lights, only brief questions and silences that stretched longer than the answers themselves. It was there that Nick Reiner, for the first time, agreed to speak about why everything reached a point of no return. According to detention records and media sources, Nick did not deny responsibility. But what stunned those present was not the admission itself. It was the way he described his actions. Nick did not call it a deliberate act, nor did he frame it as the result of calculation or hatred. "I wasn't planning anything," he said. "I just couldn't hold on anymore." It was a short sentence, but enough to reveal a mind that had been fractured for a very long time, a place where every warning had been ignored, and every final boundary eventually collapsed in silence. According to his account, at the time the incident occurred, he was in a state of severe emotional breakdown. Not a simple outburst of anger, but the sensation that everything inside his head had fallen apart at once. Thoughts, memories, anxiety, fear, all piling on top of one another in the same instant. Everything in my head felt like it collapsed. All at once, he said slowly, as if he himself were trying to piece together scattered fragments of memory. The sentence was not dramatic, but it revealed something far more frightening. The moment a person realizes that reason has left the driver's seat without them even noticing. This confession was not offered in an attempt to seek leniency. At least not in the way he described it. "I'm not saying this to be forgiven," he admitted. "I'm saying it because if I don't understand what happened inside my own mind, I won't be able to live with it." Those present recognized that he was not trying to escape the consequences. What he was attempting to do was assemble the broken pieces to answer a question he himself had never dared to face before. He did not speak much about the aftermath, perhaps because the consequences were already too clear, too heavy to need repeating. What he struggled to articulate was his inner state, a place where emotions no longer followed any familiar order. Every reaction became extreme and unbalanced. "I didn't realize what I was doing," he said quietly, "until there was nothing left to stop." That delayed awareness, more than any accusation, made the air in the room grow unbearably heavy. When asked what had pushed him into that state, Nick did not speak about the fateful night itself. Instead, he turned back to his childhood, to the years when the first cracks began to form. He grew up in a family that from the outside appeared stable and complete. A well-known household with a protected childhood and a last name people admired. Yet within that seemingly perfect environment, silences slowly began to take shape. According to Nick, what he lacked was a sense of emotional safety. "I always felt like I was standing in a room that was too big," he said, "and I never knew whether I was standing in the right place." He described growing up amid unspoken comparisons, never stated outright, but always present. No one directly told him what he had to become, yet he could feel expectations hanging in the air. There were moments when he was scolded in arguments, Within the family he did not understand, but the feeling stayed with him. I didn't understand why they were angry, he said. I only knew that I must have done something wrong. He did not portray his parents as cruel or controlling. The contrary, he repeatedly emphasized that he did not believe they were bad people. I don't think my parents were bad, he said, pausing before continuing, but I always felt like I was a failure in their eyes. That sense of failure followed him into adulthood. Every mistake became proof reinforcing an old belief that he could never do anything right. Each stumble confirmed the fear he already carried. That way of seeing himself made it increasingly difficult to accept help and increasingly easy to react in extreme ways whenever he felt cornered. Growing up under an overwhelming shadow did not create disaster overnight, but it shaped how he faced pressure, failure, and himself. As he entered adulthood, addiction crept in, gradually blending into everyday life until even he could no longer tell where habit ended and dependence began. Those years were marked not by headlines, but by cycles of rehabilitation, relapse, and returning home emotionally and physically unstable. Each return felt less like a reunion and more like an examination. His parents tried to intervene in the ways they believed were right, but over time, concern turned into tension. I no longer heard help, Nick said. All I heard was that I was disappointing everyone again. Home gradually stopped feeling like a place of recovery and began to feel like a reminder that he was the problem. There were periods when he could not return home at all, drifting into a near-homeless existence while his family continued their routines under one roof. That contrast hurt more than the addiction itself, the feeling of being shut out from a world he was supposed to belong to. Over time, Nick felt that he was no longer being heard. His words were weighed against professional opinions, and he always lost. They weren't listening to what I was saying, he recalled. They were only hearing who I was. When he spoke about the film being Charlie, he did not describe it as an achievement. Instead, he called it a conflicted milestone. His story had been told while he was still living inside it, leaving him feeling defined rather than understood. Add to that his financial dependence on his family and the feeling of being watched and mistrusted. And the pressure continued to build silently in the period leading up to the tragedy. Nick described living with untreated or poorly understood mental disorders, paranoia, emotional swings, and exaggerated reactions. Psychological experts later noted that his behavior showed no signs of planning, but rather an impulsive collapse under accumulated stress. Investigators found no single moment that caused everything to break. It was a slow erosion, warning signs dismissed one by one until only a fragile balance remained. On the day of the incident, the family had attended a Christmas party with people from the entertainment industry, including Conan O'Brien. Nothing outwardly went wrong, but for Nick it was emotionally exhausting. When they returned home, a familiar conversation escalated. Exhaustion, shame, anger, and despair surged at once. I wasn't talking to explain anymore, he said. I was talking because I couldn't bear that feeling any longer. The incident occurred inside the family home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. According to authorities, the emergency call was received around 3:40 p.m. Officers from the Los Angeles Police Department arrived to find Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, deceased. There were no signs of forced entry. Later that evening, Nick Reiner was arrested for questioning. I didn't realize what I was doing, he said, until everything was already over. Awareness came too late. What followed was silence, heavier than any scream and the irreversible end of all possibility for repair. Now, from inside a detention facility, Nick speaks less about sentencing and more about the realization that came after everything had collapsed. No explanation can undo what happened. No apology can restore what was lost. In the end, this is not a story of winners and losers. It is the story of people who loved one another but failed to heal long-standing wounds in time. Addiction and the danger of silence within families, places where everything seems fine right up until there is no longer any chance to fix what has been broken. By the time the truth is spoken, it is already too late. After the arrest, time seemed to split into two different realities. Outside the detention facility, the world moved forward with headlines, speculation, and endless commentary. Inside, Nick experienced time as something heavy and slow, each hour stretching longer than the last. Described the first nights in custody as a blur, not because he slept, but because his mind replayed fragments of memory without order or mercy. Sounds from the house, unfinished sentences, expressions on faces he could no longer bear to fully recall. He said the hardest part was not fear of punishment, but the sudden clarity that arrived too late. The moment when everything he had been trying to say for years finally made sense, but no longer mattered. He spoke about waking up in the early hours disoriented, momentarily forgetting where he was, only to remember again within seconds. That recurring realization hit him harder than any physical restraint. In those moments he felt the full weight of finality. There was no version of the future where things could be explained away, repaired, or softened. To understand him, the most were gone, and with them any chance of being heard in the way he had always hoped. Nick described a strange contradiction that followed him in custody. On one hand, he felt exposed, stripped of all defenses, finally unable to hide behind addiction, anger, or denial. On the other hand, he felt more invisible than ever. In the eyes of the system, he was no longer a son, not a patient, not even a complicated individual. He was an inmate, a case number, a problem to be processed. That reduction of identity mirrored what he had felt within his family for years, a sense of being defined by a single failure rather than by the totality of his existence. During the interviews, Nick was repeatedly asked if there was a moment he wished he could return to and change. He struggled with that question, not because he lacked regret, but because regret itself felt too small to describe what he carried. He said there were hundreds of moments he wished had gone differently, conversations he wished had slowed down instead of escalating, nights when he wished someone had sat with him without trying to fix him, but looking back he realized that the tragedy was not born from one wrong turn. It was the outcome of years of unresolved pain accumulating quietly, unnoticed by those who believed that love and intention alone were enough. He admitted that for a long time he had confused control with care. When people tried to manage his behavior, monitor his progress, or set boundaries, he experienced it as confirmation that he was untrustworthy. Instead of feeling supported, he felt trapped inside a role he could not escape. Over time, that perception distorted every interaction. Even neutral statements felt like accusations. Even concern felt like surveillance. By the end, he no longer reacted to what was being said, but to everything those words symbolized to him. Nick also reflected on how addiction reshaped his sense of self. He described it not as a constant craving, but as a narrowing of life. Interest disappeared, future plans lost meaning, relationships became transactional, measured by what they demanded rather than what they offered. Addiction, he said, did not feel dramatic while he was inside it. It felt dull, repetitive, and exhausting. The real damage came from how it reinforced his belief that he was broken beyond repair. Each relapse deepened the conviction that he was incapable of change, making it easier to give up and harder to ask for help in any sincere way. He spoke about therapy sessions where he learned the right words to say without feeling the right things. Over time, he became skilled at performing recovery rather than experiencing it. He knew how to reassure others, how to appear compliant, how to promise improvement, but inside he felt increasingly disconnected from his own emotions. That disconnection, he now believes, was one of the most dangerous elements of all. When emotions are suppressed for too long, they do not disappear. They wait. In the days following the incident, investigators tried to reconstruct the sequence of events with precision. Timelines were drawn, statements were compared, physical evidence was cataloged, but Nick's internal experience did not follow a linear structure. He described the moment of collapse as something closer to dissociation than rage. Sounds became muffled, time compressed. His body reacted faster than his thoughts. When awareness returned, the damage was already done. He said that understanding this did not lessen the horror of what happened, but it did challenge the simplistic narratives that others tried to impose. As the legal process moved forward, public reaction became increasingly polarized. Some viewed Nick solely as a perpetrator, unwilling to hear any context beyond the outcome. Others attempted to frame him entirely as a victim of circumstance, mental illness, or family pressure. Nick rejected both extremes. He insisted that responsibility and explanation were not mutually exclusive. He acknowledged that he had caused irreversible harm and that nothing could excuse that reality. At the same time, he believed that ignoring the conditions that led to the tragedy would only guarantee that similar stories would repeat elsewhere. He spoke about mental illness as something that thrives in ambiguity. Unlike physical wounds, it does not always announce itself clearly. Symptoms can be misinterpreted as personality flaws, defiance, or laziness. In families with resources, treatment can become overly procedural, relying on systems rather than relationships. I believe that somewhere along the way, the human element of care had been overshadowed by the urgency to manage risk and maintain normalcy. Everyone was trying to prevent disaster, but no one recognized how close it already was. From inside detention, Nick had ample time to reflect on how silence functions within families. Silence, he said, is often mistaken for peace. Arguments stop. Routines continue, and from the outside everything appears stable, but unresolved tension does not dissolve, it hardens. It becomes background noise that shapes every interaction. By the time conflict erupts, it feels sudden, but in reality it has been building quietly for years. He believed that his family had lived inside that silence for a very long time, each person avoiding the conversations that felt too frightening, too painful, or too complicated to confront. Nick also spoke about guilt in ways that surprised those interviewing him. He did not describe guilt as a single overwhelming emotion, but as something layered. There was guilt for the obvious loss, guilt for every moment he had dismissed help, guilt for every time he had manipulated trust, and guilt for the realization that his parents had been afraid for him long before he had been afraid for himself. That understanding came too late, but it stayed with him constantly, shaping every thought about the past. When asked what he wanted people to understand about this story, Nick said he did not want sympathy. He wanted awareness. He wanted people to recognize that mental illness does not always present itself in obvious crises. Sometimes it appears as withdrawal, defensiveness, or chronic dissatisfaction. Sometimes it hides behind intelligence, humor, or apparent functionality. Sometimes when it is left unaddressed in a meaningful way, like it reaches a breaking point that no one expects, even the person experiencing it. He also emphasized that love alone is not a cure. Good intentions do not automatically translate into effective support. Families can do everything they believe is right and still miss what matters most. Listening, he said, is not the same as waiting for your turn to speak. Hearing is not the same as understanding. In his experience, once he felt categorized as an addict, every word he spoke was filtered through that label. His fears, perceptions, and instincts were discounted before they were fully heard. Over time, that eroded his trust, not only in others, but in his own mind. The detention facility became a place of enforced stillness, something Nick had avoided his entire life. Without substances, distractions, or external conflicts, he was left alone with his thoughts. That solitude was painful, but also revealing. The first time he began to recognize patterns in his reactions, moments where fear disguised itself as anger, and shame transformed into defensiveness. He acknowledged that these insights did not absolve him of responsibility, but they offered clarity he had never allowed himself to reach before. As weeks passed, Nick began participating in structured mental health evaluations and therapy sessions. Within the system, he approached them differently this time, not as tasks to complete or hoops to jump through, but as opportunities to understand himself honestly. He said the difference was not the quality of care, but his willingness to confront uncomfortable truths without immediately trying to escape them. That shift, he believed, came only after losing everything he had once taken for granted. Still, no amount of insight softened the reality of what had been lost. Certain memories returned uninvited, moments of ordinary life that now felt unbearably significant, a conversation that had ended too abruptly, a shared meal that had passed without real connection, a chance to speak honestly that had been postponed. Those memories haunted him not because they were dramatic, because they were ordinary, reminders of how easily things could have gone differently if the underlying wounds had been addressed. Earlier, Nick also reflected on how public narratives simplify complex tragedies. Lines demand clear villains and clean explanations, but real life rarely fits those structures. In his view, reducing the story to a single act erased the long chain of failures that preceded it. Not failures of love, but failures of understanding, communication, and timely intervention. He believed that focusing solely on punishment without examining those deeper issues would offer emotional closure to the public. but little protection against future harm. As the case progressed, Nick accepted that accountability was unavoidable and necessary. He did not argue against consequences. What he struggled with was the idea that the story would end there, filed away as another shocking headline. He hoped that beyond the courtroom, people would reflect on what this tragedy revealed about mental health care, addiction treatment, and family dynamics. He hoped it would prompt difficult conversations rather than comfortable judgments. In quieter moments, Nick admitted that he no longer thought in terms of redemption. He did not see a future where things could be made right. Instead, he focused on responsibility, on understanding the harm he had caused, and on ensuring that whatever time remained to him would not be wasted in denial. If there was any meaning left to be found, he believed it lay in preventing silence from doing similar damage elsewhere. The tragedy, as he saw it, was not the result of evil intentions or sudden madness. It was the outcome of accumulated pain, left unaddressed, of systems that treated symptoms while missing the person, and of relationships strained by fear rather than strengthened by honesty. By the time everything collapsed, there were no simple answers left. Only the consequences of years spent avoiding the hardest questions. In the end, this story is not just about loss or guilt or punishment. It is about the fragile line between stability and collapse, and how easily that line can be crossed when warning signs are normalized and suffering is misunderstood. It is a reminder that silence can be as destructive as violence, and that listening deeply, early, and without judgment may be the most powerful form of intervention there is. Now, as the legal process continues and the world gradually moves on, Nick remains where everything finally stopped for him. Each day is marked not by hope for release, but by an awareness of what can never be undone. What remains is the weight of understanding arrived at too late, and the knowledge that some lessons once learned carry a cost that no one should ever have to pay.